Welcome to Money Mondays, powered by the Joseph Business School, where we bring you up to date money news for your personal finances and businesses. I'm your host, Jill Thompson. To our new viewers, thank you for tuning into our podcast. Today, we have with us Geri Aglipay, Senior Outreach Manager, Midwest and Greater Chicago, and National Women's Entrepreneurship Manager. Geraldine, Jerry Sanchez Aglipay manages Small Business Majority's outreach, education, and policy efforts in the Midwest region and Greater Chicago to enhance financial capacity and health security for small business owners, their employees, and their families. She also manages Small Business Majority's national outreach to women entrepreneurs and women business organizations. As a former solo entrepreneur, Geri is passionate about helping entrepreneurs strengthen their assets while building an inclusive economy that works for all through entrepreneurship, especially for women, communities of color, and the underserved. Geri is a member of the steering committee for the Illinois Asset Building Coalition. She was selected to the Cultivate Women of Color Leadership Program, which aims to strengthen women leaders of color in Chicago, working to advance economics, social, and racial injustice issues. She was recently appointed to serve as commissioner of the Cook County Commission for Social Innovation, and she serves on Senator Villavalum's Multicultural Advisory Committee. Money Monday audience, please help me welcome Geri Aglipay to our segment. Welcome, Geri.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to have you, Geri. And so what I want to do is I just want to open up our session to talk to our audience about why are you so passionate about what it is that you do?
Well, I think one of the reasons why I'm keen on what I do and have a passion is, small business is one way to contribute to the economic vitalities of our communities, but it's also a way to create jobs in our communities and understanding the wealth gap within the United States, especially between Black communities and family households versus white, is that we know that small businesses actually is the second best way to build wealth in this country, next to owning a home. So one of the reasons why I'm passionate about what I do is that it helps to contribute to the skills building and the growth of small businesses, the growth of job creation to help one another and increase economic development, which is especially important during this time of COVID response and recovery. We also see in this country is in terms of the wealth gap, a good number of people have trouble even affording $400 for a car emergency. So I think one of the solutions for supporting the wealth gap that we're seeing, especially among communities of color, and households is to support small business growth and creation.
I love it. And so, what has been your role in helping entrepreneurs and small business owners understand what's happening economically and how policy is affecting them?
Well, even before the pandemic, small business owners struggled to access capital and credit just to keep their businesses afloat. The uncertainty of closing businesses to prevent widespread coronavirus damage has left small business owners with a multitude of questions, unpaid bills, financial security just thrown out the window. We even have accumulating debt they can't pay back because their business operations have had a problem. The impact of this pandemic has been most especially hard hit for small business owners and business owners of color, business owners who are immigrants, and women, especially if they're in an under-resourced or disinvested neighborhood. Couple that with the changing guidelines, especially in underinvested neighborhoods, is that we see that many small business owners just simply felt deterred from applying for federal relief programs. So for me at Small Business Majority and my colleagues nationwide, we are a 501c3 national organization. We've been around for 15 years at Small Business Majority. For us, we don't just provide the education with our partners for small business owners. We don't just provide a seat at the table for policy representation, but we translate that policy for them as well. And we advocate and champion for that policy change. So that's what we do at small businesses. And that's what we're doing right now during this pandemic. We've seen for years systemic inequalities laid bare now under the coronavirus that we've known, such as access to capital and credit. It's a very difficult time for small business owners.
Mm.
What we're doing is ensuring relief measures with the policies we're advocating for and leveling that playing field.
Geri, I like what you're saying, because to me, what I hear is that you fight for the rights of small business owners. So, what would you say has been most challenging for you as well as your organization during this pandemic?
Well, again, I think what's most challenging for us is that we've been advocating for relief for small business owners. And to see a gridlock due to politics when small business owners really, it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle they're on as an owner, they just need relief. They need common sense reform and relief to keep their businesses afloat. And so that's been part of the challenge. We have been working diligently with our wonderful partners at groups like the SBA, Small Business Development Centers, Women's Business Centers, with those in government, at the mayor's office, the governor's office, and such, to make sure that business owners get the information that they need. But again, when it comes for most of the aid has been federal, and the changing guidelines, the confusion, the shifting, interpretation actually made it difficult for many small business owners. They felt like it was exhausting to apply, even though they needed the aid, because they're still trying to run their businesses. And that's been some of the challenge for us in explaining this to policymakers, is they would gladly take advantage of it, but they're too busy trying to save the storefront that they owe 4 months rent on as well, and trying to see if they can keep their revenues afloat.
I like the word you used there moments ago. You said it's been exhausting. And so when I'm thinking about the experience of women and entrepreneurs of color, what has it been like when they're applying for federal programs like PPP or EIDL?
Well, first, the PPP, so people know, is the Paycheck Protection Program. And the EIDL is the federal program that is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. So that listeners understand, the PPP was meant to supplant the wages of small business owners who are self-employed, but also their employees when they had an interruption in their wages and salaries beginning February 15th. And the EIDL, it's a part of a federal relief program when there's injuries and disasters. Normally, we're used to seeing for the EIDL over the last 20, 30 years is it comes for a response, especially those hit during natural disasters, Katrina, hurricanes, wildfire. Never before in this country, it has been unprecedented that the disaster injury loans were invoked for a virus, mass virus, and for every state and territory in the United States. Normally, when we think back, okay, Katrina is limited to some states. It was a terrible thing that happened. The wildfires, it's limited to some states. In this case, we are seeing a calamitous event that we cannot control at this point. And because we cannot control it, we are having a difficult time managing the economy. So what we're seeing is that for women and owners of color is that the PPP1, the reason I explained it is it was difficult to understand what that meant for people. They just want an immediate relief. And the EIDL, that was difficult to navigate because we have an existing program. And on top of that, it's saying, well, we've got another branch within that specifically for coronavirus, but it still exists. So there's some of the questions that we have that business owners come to us and our partners is, but I see it's still open. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a confusion there when you create a program for relief federally, but then it's under the same umbrella name as an existing program the last, 30 years as such. So that's, and they go onto maybe the wrong website and they assume that that's the same relief program for federal aid when it comes to the economic injury disaster law. And then again, the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program, there were some misunderstandings because policymakers said you can only use some of it on paychecks and some of it on your rent. There was restrictions on what you could spend down. So it made it very difficult for business owners who may not have had a lot of staff, but needed funding because maybe they're a warehouse facility and had to pay down the debts owed on that warehouse facility, for example.
Yeah. And so, Geri, it sounds as though there was maybe some difficulty with a lot of businesses struggling to access or even find the appropriate information in order to help their businesses at this time. Why is that?
The information was there. It wasn't that they had difficulty accessing it. And as I said earlier, it's that they're so busy managing their businesses. There's information that exists everywhere. We saw this problem even before COVID-19 happened. You know, business owners needed help, and there was some timely, pressing concern that they had. And you know, they weren't sure where to turn to, so maybe they would go to an SBDC and such, which is wonderful resources. But again, when you're in an emergency and your back is against the wall as a business owner, it is very difficult to spend 100% of your time trying to find the assistance that you need. And there are voluminous sources out there, including our source, venturize.org, while tending to your business. You have to understand, a business owner, they're their own marketing person. They're the HR person for themselves. They're the marketer. They're the producer of that service or goods. Small business owners, most of Main Street America have under 10 employees. That business owner is doing everything for themselves. They don't have dedicated staffer like a 100-person shop to keep the operations going and keep revenue going while they look for funding. So you're asking the business owner, you know, to put in additional time for that. And as I said earlier, some were just exhausted. We've spoken to some business owners who said, yeah, I'm too busy keeping my business afloat to learn everything at once and try to get in and prepare applications when we're hearing that so many, when it may not even be complete, or I don't have time to get that information. So it's a conflation of things. It wasn't that they have difficulty accessing it. The information is voluminous. It's also the reality of the time that a business owner has to absorb and process and understand what the aid is that's coming to them.
Yeah. So were there any programs at either the federal or state level that were more effective at reaching small businesses of color?
I don't think there's anything that's more effective than reaching small business owners of color. It's not about, is there anything that's more effective to reach them? It's that they're all quite effective in reaching the small business owners of color. It's more of, we know that we at Small Business Majority have been pushing for grants for small businesses at the beginning of this. And we know that that's needed more than ever. So the reality is what we feel is the solution isn't, you know, is it more effective or not? It's more of, you know, where's the federal funding going? Grants versus loans. And we at Small Business Majority are trying to make sure there's equitable and effective distribution of the funds. So we're moving now into not accessing it, but really from the dispersing entity, is there effective and equitable distribution of the funds of that?
So, you know, Geri, I like what you're saying right now, because I know you mentioned grants, and it kind of sets the framework for my next question for you, which is, what do small businesses need long term that can help them survive this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Great question. You know, in order for small businesses to survive this pandemic, they need help during and after the pandemic, not just immediately, one time, and let them figure it out on themselves. We, as a community of small businesses, advocates, even supporters and customers, we need to approach policies going forward with a more long-term, comprehensive approach that helps with the sustainability of small businesses. For example, at a federal level, and I'm talking at federal level here versus state because it really is a systemic issue. And if we want to address systems change for small business owners, especially those of color, we need to address how we can change the lever in the system that will trickle down. Mm-hmm. So at the federal level, we've been advocating for expanding not just investment, but capacity for the CDFIs. That's the Community Development Financial Institutions, nonprofit microlenders backed up by the US federal government. investing in those for distributing funds in their communities. It also helps the CDFIs expand their capacities. If you go to a CDFI, a micro lender, you are 20 times more likely to get that technical assistance and handholding than if you were to go to a large bank. They're there to make sure that you are prepared with your application. They also know that life happens. They understand at the CDFIs that some of you as business owners may be recovering still from the last recession in 2008. And they're just starting to get a footing again, and then boom, the pandemic occurs. So the CDFIs would actually be helpful in having women and owners of color expand their businesses more equitably, distributing them. We want to ensure there's more liquidity, there's more money flowing into them, as well as funding for technical assistance concurrent with the funds that would be going to women and owners of colors in these underserved areas, particularly. And the reason I say that, and maybe they're not necessarily in underserved areas, but we're also talking about people who may be underbanked and may not have less assets. And the reality is that women and people of color in the United States tend to have less assets, and thereby less of an ability to weather an economic adverse condition when the pandemic hits and such. So, we also want to provide more immediate funding for business assistance providers. I've mentioned the SBDC network. Would love to see more funding invested in the current ones, not just an expansion of it, but invest in the strengthening of the capacity for the current ones, as well as an expansion of that. And this is really key, creating and extending a part of the Truth in Lending Act within for consumers within the CFPB, actually extending that Truth in Lending Act disclosure requirements to small business owners' credit products. Right now, it's just limited to consumer products. But when you extend the Truth in Lending Act so that small businesses who are struggling, they will not be taken advantage of by unscrupulous lenders who are not regulated during this time. I've seen already the FTC put out warning advisories on at least 3 online lenders providing small business loans at this time. Online lending is not regulated by the federal government, actually. So we, as a country, under the Obama administration, they had tried their hardest to get that passed. But unfortunately, and this is why policies matter, there was a deadlock Congress, and we were unable to get federal regulations for online lenders. Fast forward to now, since we don't have any federal regulation for online lenders, there are small business owners whose backs are up against the wall and may be turning to some of these unscrupulous online lenders. If we at least extend the Consumer Product Truth in Lending Act to small businesses, we can begin to dismantle a culture of predatory lending within the small businesses ecosystem that, unfortunately negatively impacts women and owners of color.
Geri, as you're talking, in light of reports that minority-owned and vulnerable small businesses struggle to access these federal loans, how can lawmakers guarantee that when new relief funding becomes available, that it actually goes to the businesses that are most in need?
Well, one critical aspect to ensure that small businesses, especially owners of color, are going to receive the funds that are necessary to survive and bounce back in this COVID economy is to, one, guarantee set-asides, carve-outs, specifically for the smallest of the small businesses. We're talking, by the SBA's definition, micro businesses, 10 employees or less, but that also includes self-employed small business owners, of which over 90% of self-employed small business owners who do not employ anybody else, over 90% of those are African American. So they are small businesses, but they may be a self-employed shop. So if you create a set aside for that, and especially for community lenders, it would help to ensure the smallest of the small would help get the assistance that they need, and from lenders that they trust. Also, we have heard repeatedly from small business owners of color who were denied federal funding even when they were required to do a credit check. Now the banks, they weren't, they did not have to do a credit check, but some of them, because there wasn't explicitly a code to say don't do a credit check, decided to do a credit check anyways, which then made them ineligible for where their white counterparts weren't able to do that. And some of them became ineligible for funding. It's super imperative that any legislation that is created, we have you as small business owners, and those of you who are listening, we have you alongside us, telling your stories and championing what happened. One of the most heartbreaking stories that I heard was an African-American business owner who, before the Affordable Care Act was created, the savings that she had from her career in federal government was decimated from cancer treatments. And that was because, unfortunately, we did not have the Affordable Care Act then, and was not protected for her finances. But they started over. They started over, created a business. And, you know, this person was required to do a credit check with their bank, even though the Paycheck Protection Program did not require it. So that further set them aside in relation to, to others in terms of trying to access those funds. So there are certain conditions that we, in stories that we've heard of, which vetting mechanisms are just inconsistently applied to small business owners. The problem is it doesn't matter what race or ethnicity, but in the end, the damage is that we see disproportionately owners of color still get affected.
Wow. And so, how exactly does the Community Reinvestment Act play a part in this? And why is it important for small businesses of color?
I'm glad you asked that question. People wonder, what is that? What is the CRA and why is it important? It's actually an act for government agencies to review the records of banks and their performance records to make sure that they're appropriately meeting the community's needs in capital and credit, whether it be housing, small business, or other concerns. It works hand in hand with fair lending laws. Look at the CRA, and this is why it's important for small business owners to champion CRA. The CRA is sort of the checks and balances behind the scenes that takes a look at the records of a bank's lending performance and how much it supports small business owners, including in low and moderate income areas and in census tracts across the country. So what it does, it's a behind the scenes act that actually places conditions on making sure that the banks are appropriately lending fairly across their communities. It's like a process is on the bank end to comply, and then they're given a grade. So that's why the CRA is important. It may not be outward facing, but it's an important and significant law, the law that actually asks government agencies to review the bank's performance records and see if they're lending safely and responsibly.
And this is for all banks?
Banks that are subject to the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act, yes.
Okay, awesome. And so are there other federal measures or regulations that small businesses of color should be supportive of in the breaking down barriers or of access to capital?
I touched upon it earlier. Truth in lending laws, expanding that disclosure requirements to small business is critical, absolutely critical to breaking down barriers in accessing capital and credit. What many people don't realize is that small businesses, they're actually not subject to the same regulations and requirements as consumer loans, which is why we are advocating that the consumer loan for truth in lending be extended to small business owners, because it's leaving many small business owners vulnerable to predatory practices. In fact, there's a bill in Congress right now that would prevent predatory lenders from taking advantage of small business owners who need capital. All small businesses should support measures to collect demographic data from federal loan programs like the PPP. And this was a sticking point for us at Small Business Majority. We were advocating this. We put out a press release. We wanted it to be known and public. Who is asking for these loans? Who are they being accorded to? What is their race and ethnicity? Where is the neighborhoods and where these businesses are located who are receiving these loans? What is the gender? It is absolutely critical to understand the demographic information, not just for the PPP, but for other loan products that are being created as well. But the PPP, again, has pulled back the curtain on what we've been advocating for because there was such a spotlight on it. We are saying and advocating what we're requesting for that transparency for the PPP loan should be transparent for all the loans so that we better understand what capital is being deployed, who is actually deploying it properly, and is it from the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA? Are they really doing it when we look back?
Yeah. So what should be top priority before the next administration for small businesses, regardless of the election's outcome?
You know, a lot of small business owners in this country feel like they've been abandoned by lawmakers. They've held on by whatever means necessary during the past several months, but yet there's still congressional inaction. But regardless of the outcome of this election, in the next 8 days, Congress and the administration absolutely must prioritize small business needs. There is a wave of permanent closures, again, that is sweeping this country as we come upon the third wave, as they're reporting, of the coronavirus, and we're setting into winter. If lawmakers continue to delay passing a solid, comprehensive relief bill for small business owners, including the self-employed, which I said, you know, there's over 95% of them, 90%, I believe, are African-American small business owners. The stimulus package must support also sustainable recovery. Small Business Majority actually just completed a survey. We asked what the number one priority would be for Congress and the White House before Election Day, in less than 8 days. A majority of them, 55%, rate that it's important to negotiate for a comprehensive stimulus package, bipartisan. Number one priority, relief for small business owners, followed by 29% who want to see a standalone small business relief bill. 5% want to see another round of stimulus checks for some Americans, and 4% want to see the Supreme Court nominee confirmed. But the results that we received is that most of them want to see a bipartisan relief package.
I understand. You know, Geri, as you were talking, it reminds me of a biblical scripture where it talks about in Hosea 4:6 that my people perish for lack of knowledge. And so there's so many, I would honestly say you've really given something beyond nuggets. I mean, because you've talked about, I was taking my own personal notes. You talked about set aside programs. You talked about CDFI funds. You talked about community reinvestment acts. And so there's two questions that come to mind. How much money are we really leaving on the table and do not know that it's there? And then what are the resources where small businesses can go to learn about these funding opportunities?
When you ask for clarification, what do you mean by how much money is being left on the table?
So when
you mean by federal aid or?
So when we think about, like, there is the Community Reinvestment Act, and so that these banks are obligated to give back funds towards small or minority businesses in these areas, right?
Oh, well, it's not to give back funds. So let me clarify that. The CRA is a law that mandates that there's a checks and balances behind the scenes for the banks to make sure that they are equitably distributing, lending, and doing business across the neighborhoods, including low and moderate income areas. So the CRA is not about mandating funds. It's to make sure that they're equitably, distributing and deploying it. And that works hand in hand with fair lending laws. So that's behind the scenes, and it's a way of checks and balance measures for, myself, if I was with the federal government agency, say, show me your records. Let's see how well you've been doing the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And so that's want to make clear about that for the CRA. But it's a very important law to have, because to advocate for it means that you're advocating for a system of checks and balances, I'd like to say, just as an analogy, for the government to make sure that the banks are doing what they're doing safely and responsibly. Where can they go? is being engaged. Being engaged with your civic responsibilities. Voting is important because your vote represents what you're supporting for policies as a small business owner. Be engaged with your local representatives, but also be engaged with small business groups, local advocacy groups. Small Business Majority is one of them. We are unbiased source on both sides of the aisle because we are also not a membership group. So we can provide some of the representation and engagement with small business owners across the aisle. Small Business Majority can connect people to their representatives on policies. But there's also key resources. We have a wonderful website, venturize.org, which is a national online hub to access knowledge and tools. We've even built out a COVID-19 resource page for that. You can find the SBDCs and other vetted technical assistance centers on there as well. It's also got resources there to navigate better understanding for small business owners what is happening with health insurance. We are one of the few, I would say we're probably the best group that actually explains it in a very translatable and understandable manner about what some of these policies mean to small business owners every day.
That's good, Geri. And so you just brought up our last question, which is, and I know you said it's venturize.org,
Yep.
but if there's Money Monday audience, there are business owners or even women business owners that are watching now, how can they get in contact with you, or where can they go to learn more about your organization?
Well, they can visit www.smallbusinessmajority.org. They can also contact me at Geri Aglipay at smallbusinessmajority.org. That's Geri Aglipay at smallbusinessmajority.org. We'd love for, especially women, we'd love to hear your stories. We'd love to hear your stories how you started up. We'd like to hear your stories about how you've pivoted. We'd like to hear your stories also about how maybe you may have encountered some challenges getting funding. Even if there was a predatory instance, we can't help one another improve and survive this until we hear those stories of resiliency, even if it was surviving a predatory lender. We need to hear those stories to inspire, but we also need to hear those stories and share them with us to lead. And we also need it for change, because we can't advocate for change unless policymakers hear from you. And we are there as a nonprofit to help you do that.
Geri, thank you so much for actually joining us here for our Money Monday segment. The word that you have provided has been on time, and I'm sure our business owners are going to be jumping at the bit to try to get in contact with you. We appreciate you for coming on our segment today.
Thank you. I hope so. And thank you all for listening and participating in Money Mondays.
So everybody, don't forget, make sure you get out there and vote. The election is just around the corner. We look forward to seeing you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.